So I am continuing on with the 60s, which was a totally chaotic decade, and the decade that I really grew up about the same age that you were. And it's not surprising my generation is really pessimistic about a lot of things. First of all, we started the decade with this huge promise with JFK and his new society, the new frontier. We're going to space, we're going to do all these great things. Then he's assassinated. Same time, not the same time, but several years later in 68, in April, Martin Luther King, who has led the civil rights movement for a long time, is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, leading a garbage workers' strike. 5 months later, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated in Los Angeles. At this point, most of us thought the world was falling apart. It was totally chaotic. We didn't know what was going to come next. Your generation has these mass shootings, but this was new in my generation. People didn't get shot that often, and to shoot major figures like that was just unheard of at the time. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, the immediate reaction in every single black area of every single in the country were riots. The only place that didn't have a riot was in Akron, Ohio, where Bobby Kennedy happened to be giving a speech. He was running for the president on the Democratic Party, and his aides came to him and said, MLK has been assassinated, he's been shot. Your audience is 90% black that you're talking to tonight. Don't go out there. There are riots all over. And Bobby Kennedy said, I'm going out there. And he went out there and he talked for about an hour. He talked about, of course, the ancient Greeks and dealing with tragedy, and said, I know a thing or two about assassinations. His brother had been assassinated. This is not how we deal with it. We come together. We help each other. We make a better society. The only city in the country that did not have major race riots at that time was Akron, Ohio, thanks to Bobby Kennedy. I was living in Chicago at the time. I was a young kid. I could see the South Side, the black area of Chicago, burning. If you looked outside your window, you could see it on the horizon. The whole world looked like it was falling apart. Part of that problem, of course, was the other half of LBJ's legacy. We talked about the Great Society and the wonderful things he did. The other half is Vietnam. And I left off with his plan to end poverty. I did not talk about his civil rights actions. So if you look at text number 23, I think, where we are, Lyndon Johnson not only put money into civil rights, into job programs and Head Start and housing and everything else, particularly for minorities, but also for poor whites as well. The minute he was reelected, went to Congress, and again, I would recommend the Cotula speech, LBJ Cotula speech, Cotulla. It's all of 2 minutes long. And he said, now that I'm elected on my own, I have the power and I'm going to use it. He never forgot the year he spent teaching in a dirt poor Hispanic school in Cotula, Texas. He pushed through Congress because, remember, he's a master of politics. He pushed through the strongest civil rights act in American history, including Abraham Lincoln, and put the force of the federal government behind it. The federal government said, you must integrate, you must end desegregation. Anything that involved public access or public money had to be desegregated, and LBJ said, we will put the force of the federal government behind it. Now, there's some kind of gray areas here. If it was a private club, like some of the golf clubs or a country club, that was privately funded. They did not have to integrate. But schools, buses, anything that involved public access or public money had to be integrated, and was very, very quickly after that. So LBJ's two great legacies are the Great Society, two parts of that, integration, civil rights, and the war on poverty. And he would have gone down as one of the best presidents in American history, except for Vietnam, which is largely also on his watch. So if you move down to Slide 24. If you want a good treatment of Vietnam, Ken Burns, of course, has done a multi-part documentary on Vietnam. I watched the whole thing. It was very good. What he did for the first time is get North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese on both sides to talk on the documentary. He interviewed people from all sides of the war, and this had not been done previously. It's a fairly recent documentary. I think if you can find a short 2-hour documentary called The Fall of Saigon, it is even more gripping, I think, and talks about the horrors of the last days of Saigon in South Vietnam before we pulled out. Also very good. Vietnam is our generation's 9/11, is our generation's coronavirus, whatever you want to call it. It tore the country apart, and it tore Lyndon Johnson apart as well, and absolutely destroyed him as well. So Vietnam, this is his great tragedy. Great domestic president, but LBJ is remembered for the war, and it is a failed war. Because the war escalated, because the war cost so much money, he could no longer fund the Great Society programs. It became, as they said at the time, either guns or butter, and the money went to the guns. In other words, the butter ran out. So would the war on poverty have succeeded? It had already cut the number of poor people in half. If it had continued, it would have continued to decline. You're never going to get rid of poverty completely, but it probably would have continued to have declining numbers. So what are the assumptions? How did we get into Vietnam? If you remember, it's not Johnson who got us there. It was Eisenhower. Eisenhower did not send more than a handful of advisors, but he did send lots of money as the French pull out of Southeast Asia. Then we move in to replace the French. Why do we care about that? This is part of containment and a new twist on that, which was called at the time the domino theory, which also involves the spread of communism. These assumptions were never questioned. Now, today, of course, we question them, but at the time, nobody openly questioned them. The assumption was that the communists in North Vietnam were directed and allied with Chinese communists to the north of them. We have to prove that we are tougher, that communism will not be allowed to spread. The actual facts, which we know now, is that the North Vietnam had already been in the distant past under Chinese control, didn't want Chinese control, had fought the Chinese, then fought the French. When we replaced the French, they fought us. They are fighting basically a war of independence. The domino theory is directly involved here. The theory was if we allow South Vietnam to go communist, then all of Southeast Asia will follow. And again, this assumption was not questioned. First of all, Laos was already under pretty much communist control. Cambodia had an independent, more or less democratic monarchy under Prince Sihanouk. Kept the guerrillas weak. We deposed him. We replaced him with a fairly incompetent American puppet in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge, the communist guerrillas, move in. There's a power vacuum. They take over Cambodia and slaughtered something like 25 to 30% of the civilian population, their own people. So that part was true. Thailand was independent, was pro-Western, still is independent and pro-Western. So the domino theory, yes and no, but it wasn't going to change too much on the ground. And when we did go in, the opposite happened. Lyndon Johnson, Vietnam is the cornerstone of Southeast Asia, the keystone in the arch, the finger in the dike. If we pull back now, we'll be saying to the world that we don't stand by our friends. So containment and the domino theory, which is still around. We still talk about the domino theory, particularly in the Mideast. Afghanistan's another example of that. What was our problem with self-determination. Vietnam, the North had already gone communist. If you look at, let me get my numbers here. If you look at slide number 31, you have the nationalist communist leader of North Vietnam, who later became their George Washington in essence. In his 20s, Ho Chi Minh had studied in France, he had studied in Europe, and from a very young man, he had set his life to get independence from colonial powers for Vietnam. So he is, in a way, exactly like George Washington was to the Americans. In fact, he quoted the Declaration of Independence at times. All of Vietnam wants democracy, wants independence. What they have in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s basically was a civil war between Viet Cong, communist North Vietnamese, and pro-Western South Vietnamese. And of course, we threw in with the South. Vietnam had been a French colony. If you look at those maps, slide 27 and 28, you can see what's happening worldwide in history. All of those countries in red around the world, most of Africa, most of Southeast Asia, were gaining independence from their colonial powers. So Vietnam is just another part of this independence movement that is worldwide. But Ho Chi Minh, no question about it, was communist. That was the regime he wanted to put in. He did defeat the French, Dien Bien Phu, in 1954, and North Vietnam becomes communist, and he becomes the leader of North Vietnam. We had a treaty at the end of that event in 54 that split Vietnam into North and South. They were supposed to hold national elections. Didn't happen. And as Ho Chi Minh said, it is the duty of our generation to die for our country, and many of them did. Now, again, I'm speaking as an American. If a South Vietnamese was teaching this part of the class, it would be slightly different history. If a North Vietnamese was teaching this part of the class, it would be a slightly different history. I'm trying to stick to just the facts as they relate to American history, but there is still a lot of controversy over Vietnam. The assumption was, of course, that we needed to have a pro-Western government to hold back the communist forces. So Eisenhower went in, even when the French were there. JFK, when North and South split, put a lot of U.S. aid. Most of South Vietnam, the government, the military, was supported and armed by the United States. And again, JFK has this problem with being tough and showing he's tough. He had to show the Russians and the Chinese communists that we are tough. I'm quoting from JFK, "Now we have a problem trying to make our power credible, and Vietnam looks like the place. It is a good test case to show how powerful the United States is." We also had interest in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. There were resources. Khrushchev, who's premier of Russia, had called JFK a coward. He's a young new president. He has to basically show he's tough. So while Eisenhower put very few boots on the ground but a lot of money, JFK, by the time he's assassinated, has 16,000 Americans in Vietnam, many of them in combat operations. He also, and how much this is a factor, we don't know, but the people put in charge of South Vietnam were also the people who were very important under the French regime. And the French, of course, being Catholic, had introduced Catholicism. 95% of Vietnamese were Buddhist, but the leaders were Catholic. And remember, Kennedy is Catholic as well. We don't know how much of this. In June of 63, South Vietnamese began protests because the ruling group, who were Catholic, started to put Catholic flags on top of some Buddhist pagodas. This did not go very well. You can imagine the reaction today, for example, if we had Islamic flags being put over Protestant churches, the same kind of a thing. There are riots led by Buddhist monks, and you can see nonviolent passive resistance, self-immolation. They torched as a public protest against this action, against the ruling government. A number of people are killed, pagodas are destroyed, monks are arrested, protests continue. The South Vietnamese leader was deposed, he is later assassinated, and then he is succeeded by a series of military leaders. There are a series of coups, one military coup after the other, and we really don't know what to do. We support the military coups because they are not communist and say they support us. The assumption was that America is the world superpower in terms of military might, that we would destroy the North Vietnamese communists. We came close to it. By 1968, when LBJ finishes his term, we have dropped more bombs on Vietnam than were ever used total in world history. In 1971 alone, close to 1 million tons of bombs were dropped. LBJ continued Kennedy's policies, and this is the quagmire part. He gets sucked in slowly, more and more troops. His military advisors say, well, we can win this thing if we get more troops. And he sent more troops. By 68, we have over 500,000, 542,000 Americans are fighting on the ground in Vietnam. LBJ likes the power, of course, of the presidency. He assumes that with the power he has, that he can win in Vietnam. He's never lost. And he doesn't want to be the president that loses a war and withdraws. He took it personally. And he said, we are willing to pay any price for as long as possible for Vietnamese freedom, for the South to stay non-communist. Nobody ever asked about what price and for how long. And it becomes clear year after year that there is no end to this, that this is a quagmire. Our information on the ground, our intelligence on the ground was 100% accurate as it filters through the military establishment, and particularly as it filters through Washington and gets back to Lyndon Johnson. It's pretty clear in hindsight, we know now, that he did not get accurate information. The guys on the ground were giving accurate information, but it did not get through to the White House and the decision makers. 20 years we were in Vietnam. As you know, on the Vietnam Memorial, there are over 58,000 names, and we don't even know, but an estimated 3 million Vietnamese casualties. Finally, some of his advisors who are knowledgeable about the situation begin to say, and I'm quoting again, with due respect, Mr. President, the Joint Chiefs don't know what the hell they're talking about. We cannot win this war. This is the beginning of this long train of events where people do not trust the government. It started in Vietnam. We learned later that they were not telling us the truth. Field officers, absolutely accurate, but it was changed, the information was changed to please politicians and then to please the public, so we could get public support. 1 month before the French surrendered in 1954, the United States was being told that the French are going to win this with no problem. The Pentagon Papers later on proved that there were no Chinese and very few communists in South Vietnam, that this was an internal civil war. Sorry about the phone in the background. Okay, so key events. Lyndon Johnson has to have a reason to escalate the war, to send in more troops, and that reason is the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is August of 1964. Okay, this is shortly after he succeeded Kennedy. This is a quote-unquote provocative incident. There is a North Vietnamese patrol boat, communist patrol boat. It fires on a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin, someplace along the 12-mile border which is out at sea, separating nationalist waters from international waters. The U.S. destroyer fires back. Who fired first? What exactly happened? It's still pretty fuzzy today. But LBJ goes to Congress and asks for, very famous quote, all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and prevent further aggression. Congress gives it to him. Over the next several years, LBJ went again and again for money because the president does not have access to money. He has access only to what Congress gives him, and Congress gave it to him every time. So this was the incident that allowed LBJ to escalate the war, the Gulf of Tonkin, and we still don't know exactly what happened out there. In the beginning, what we did is send small groups of troops along with South Vietnamese military and tried to create villages, fortified villages, basically, strategic hamlets, they called it. They tried to secure the countryside. Part of the problem with Vietnam at the time was 95% rural. The same problem we have in Afghanistan, the same problem we had in Iraq. How do you conquer a 95% rural country? Britain had the same problem in the American Revolution. It's almost impossible. So what we decided is we will create fortified villages. We will move all the peasant farmers into these villages. Anybody outside the village was assumed to be a communist. But of course, the problem was, how do you know? How do you tell a good Vietnamese from a bad Vietnamese? How do you tell a good Afghan from a bad Afghan? We didn't. Farmers can't farm if they're held up in fortified villages. All kinds of atrocities began to appear. Remember, you have a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds with a little bit of training thrown into jungle warfare. And outside of the Philippines, this is our introduction to jungle warfare. That strategic hamlet plan was not working very well. It was succeeded by search and destroy missions. So American platoons went out into the rural countryside of Vietnam to hunt down and kill Vietnamese communists. And again, the big issue is, how do you tell? How do you know? Because they weren't wearing uniforms. Much higher death rates of Americans as a direct result. We estimate 50, 60,000 civilians were also killed. Remember that we found, our own CIA said there are not too many communists in South Vietnam. When the death rates get higher and that system is not working really well, we turn to what America has always done very well. We turn to technology, and we began, as the phrase was at the time, bomb them back to the Stone Age. We will use aircraft. We will use a bombing campaign. Again, think about this. Vietnam is 95% rural, small towns at the most, very little industry, very little transportation. What are you bombing? We began to bomb the supply routes, and this is in 65, as early as 65. The goal was destroy their morale. If we had studied the British in World War II, as many people said, when you bomb a country, it usually improves their morale. When Germany bombed the hell out of London and Britain, the British became more firm in their resolve to defeat Germany, and that's exactly what happened in Vietnam as well. Didn't ruin morale, it raised morale among the Vietnamese. There are some slides there. Some of the things we used, napalm, Agent Orange. Napalm is an incendiary, and that picture of very famous picture of the little girl running down the street, she has ripped off her clothes because napalm burns when it lands on you. She was burned. She did survive. They have looked her up, and she actually did survive that incident. Agent Orange is a defoliant, brightly colored orange. Again, bombing campaigns. What is the goal of taking the leaves off of all the trees, killing the vegetation? The goal was then you can see your enemy. Again, this is a 95% rural country. What it did do, didn't find out too many enemies, but what it did do is it is a neurotoxin. It is a cancer agent. So not only high rates of cancer in Vietnam among the Vietnamese, but also among our own troops, down to today, much higher incidence of particularly blood cancers like leukemia. So our strategy shifted. None of this is succeeding. The key incident, the turning point in Vietnam, I'll see my time here, was the Tet Offensive. And that is slide number 38. The Tet Offensive was January 30th, 1968, on the Chinese New Year, which was also celebrated in Vietnam. This is a coordinated communist North Vietnamese attack on every major city in South Vietnam. They had about 100,000 soldiers who swept through the South. Their assumption was if we attack all of the major cities, that the South Vietnamese will rise up and join us. That didn't happen. They weren't all supporting the Vietnamese communists. But Hue, the old traditional capital, a number of cities fell, and that next slide there shows a big square building. That is the American embassy in Saigon. Saigon was also under attack. The communists took over several parts of the city, and an elite squad directly attacked the American embassy compound, which was highly fortified. They didn't take it, but they almost did. And of course, we have news crews, and we are seeing this live. One of the key factors in Vietnam that is very different than the wars we're fighting today, they are still undeclared wars. We never declared war on Vietnam, but it was a televised war. We didn't embed reporters and troops. They had the run of the place. They could go anywhere. They had a fairly high death rate too. Photographers, film crews were all over the place. And we are seeing live footage the day that it happens. We are seeing people blown up. We are seeing screaming soldiers. We are seeing Vietnamese civilians. We are seeing villages being destroyed. It's a key factor in the war because once the public begins to see this, sentiment against the Vietnam War builds pretty rapidly. Some of our newsmen, Walter Cronkite was the Anderson Cooper of our generation, the most trusted newsman on television. He visited South Vietnam immediately after the Tet Offensive. He did some investigating, got on national TV, and said publicly to the nation, we didn't have cable, we just had 3 channels then, said publicly to the nation, we are losing this war. There is no way America is going to win. And he finally said what a lot of people were beginning to suspect. So the effects of Tet, you can see immediately in the next slide or two. Public support shifts. People begin to openly oppose the war. The majority of Americans supported our efforts in Vietnam until Tet, until it becomes clear we are never going to win this thing. And you begin to get, remember this is 68, you begin to get in that fall, Tet was January of 68, you immediately begin to get peace candidates. Lyndon Johnson was another casualty of the war in Vietnam, and he decides that summer, I will not seek nor will I accept the nomination of my party. Johnson was destroyed by Vietnam. He decides, I will not run for re-election. He had succeeded Kennedy. He had won on his own once. He was planning to run again. It destroyed him, and it destroyed the country as well. I'm going to stop there because I'm running out of time here. Pick it up next time, and then we will move. This is in part of 2 chapters in the 60s, but also in the 70s. And of course, I'm putting Vietnam as one big unit because Richard Nixon takes over and does some other things in Vietnam. So we'll continue next time with it. Stay safe out there.